Welcome to Twilight Fables, where we tell stories for you to sleep. If you can, you know the tale, don't you? A beautiful girl, skin like snow, a jealous queen with a poisoned apple. It's one of the oldest fairy tales whispered through time, told with sweetness and sparkle, with cheerful dwarfs and a happily ever after. But fairy tales weren't always kind. Long before the story was softened for children, it was something darker, a tale of blood, of envy that rotted the soul, and of a mirror that whispered more than just vanity. It spoke truths no one dared face. And the forest, it was never a place of refuge, but something ancient and watching. Tonight, we return to the version you were never told. Tonight, we peer into the mirror and see what Snow White really became. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and follow us into the woods. The first time the mirror spoke, the queen was alone in her chambers. It was late, long after the servants had retired, after the candles in the hall had been snuffed, and only the sighing wind remained, brushing against the castle walls. The queen stood before the great mirror, tall and ornate, its frame blackened with age and carved with roses whose thorns curled like claws. She had never spoken to it aloud before, but tonight something compelled her, a tension in the air, a pull. She traced her reflection with one finger, her nails clicking softly on the cold glass. "Mirror," she whispered, "who is the fairest of them all?" There was silence, then, soft, like the rustle of dead leaves, came a voice. "Not you." She gasped and stepped back, her fingers trembling. The mirror did not ripple, her reflection did not move, and yet the voice had been real, not a hallucination, not a dream. She clutched the silk of her robe tightly and leaned in, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Then who?" The mirror pulsed faintly, like a thing alive. A girl, pale as frost, with hair like spilled ink and lips the colour of heart's blood. The queen's mouth went dry. Snow White. She was barely a child, not yet 12, her stepdaughter, born of the previous queen, who had died the winter snow came into the world. The girl had always been quiet, unassuming, always watching, but beautiful, undeniably so. Even the maids whispered it when they thought no one was listening. The queen had noticed the way men's eyes lingered on the child, how they softened, how the air shifted around her like something unseen bent to her presence. It wasn't right. It wasn't earned. The queen had carved her beauty out of years of discipline, masks and ritual. She wore bone-white powder, crushed pearls on her eyelids, and coiled her hair like serpents around a crown of gold. She had suffered to become the woman kings feared and men desired. Snow White had done nothing but be born, and now the mirror, the cursed, ancient thing left behind by the last sorceress queen, had chosen her. The queen's face hardened. She turned, swept her robe behind her, and extinguished the final candle. But she did not sleep that night. Snow's room was at the farthest end of the west wing, isolated, quiet. She liked it that way. The wind there whistled differently, slipping through the cracks in the stone, with a soft song that lulled her to sleep. She was sitting on her bed, brushing her hair in the moonlight, when the door creaked open. It wasn't the maid, it was her stepmother. The Queen stood in the doorway in silence for a long moment, her silhouette tall and statuesque, as though carved from the same stone as the castle itself. Snow set her brush down gently. "Stepmother?" she asked, her voice careful. The Queen stepped inside. Her gaze was strange, too calm, too bright. "You're growing into a woman," she said. "You should have a proper gown." Snow blinked. "I have gowns. Not like this one," the Queen said. She drew a parcel from behind her back, wrapped in grey silk, tied with a single black ribbon. Snow hesitated. "Go on," the Queen said. "It's for you." The girl took it, heart fluttering. She pulled the ribbon loose, let the silk fall. Inside was a dress of deepest red. It shimmered faintly in the moonlight, with stitching so fine it looked like veins. Snow's fingers brushed the fabric. "It's beautiful," the Queen smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Put it on," she said. That night, Snow dreamed of forests, not the sunlit woods beyond the garden where she sometimes wandered, but an older forest, knotted with roots and thick with fog. In the dream, she was running, branches tearing at her skin, something chasing her just beyond the reach of sound. When she awoke, the red gown lay at the foot of her bed, and her window was open. Though she remembered closing it, she closed it again, and this time she latched it tight. Days passed, then weeks, and something shifted. Snow began to feel eyes on her in the halls, though when she turned, no one was there. Her maid, Elsa, grew pale and quiet, glancing often over her shoulder. The other girls stopped coming to her room. The cook avoided her gaze. The huntsman, who had always brought her carved wooden animals, stopped visiting entirely, and every morning the red dress hung in her wardrobe, though she had never worn it. Once she tried to throw it in the fire. It did not burn. Instead, the flames recoiled, snapping backward as if afraid. She left it in the hearth and locked her door, but the next morning it was hanging neatly again in her wardrobe, smoothed, unwrinkled, and faintly warm. The Queen had not visited since the night she gave the gift, but the mirror had, not in the waking world, but in dreams. Snow found herself standing before it, though she had never been to the Queen's chambers. Its frame writhed in her vision, its surface not reflecting but revealing. It showed her a version of herself she did not recognize, older, paler, with lips dark as dried blood, and eyes full of something she couldn't name. Each night it whispered, "Wear the dress." Snow resisted. She told herself it was just a dream, just unease, until the night she awoke, standing barefoot in the hall, her hand on the handle of her wardrobe. Down in the kitchens, a rumour began to spread that the Queen spoke to something not of this world, that the King's death had not been by fever, as the court had claimed, but by poison, slow and unseen, and that the Queen was no longer entirely human. Snow overheard the whispers. She heard her name tangled in them too, that she was cursed, that she had been marked. She didn't want to believe it, not until the day she walked past the Queen's chambers and heard two voices speaking inside. One was her stepmother, the other was nothing human. Its voice was low and cold, like breath on a window. "She is almost ready," it said. "Then you will be the fairest, forever." The forest had always called to Snow, even as a child. She remembered trailing behind her mother before she died, small fingers clutched in the warmth of a larger hand, walking between the ancient trees. Her mother used to say the woods were older than the kingdom, older than the stones of the castle, older even than the stars, if you knew where to look. After her death, Snow returned to the woods alone, and though she no longer remembered her mother's face, she remembered the feeling of being watched, not with malice, but with quiet curiosity. Now, as she ran, barefoot, breathless, into that same forest, she felt that gaze again. It was the only place left to go, because tonight the Queen had come for her, not with poison, not with words, but with a blade. It had started at supper. The Queen had insisted Snow dine with her, just the two of them. The room had been filled with flickering candlelight, and the thick perfume of roses wilting in their vases. Snow had eaten little. The Queen had eaten nothing at all. "You've grown," the Queen said, watching her across the table. "You remind me of your mother." Snow hesitated. The Queen never spoke of her mother. "She was beautiful," Snow said. The Queen's lips curled. "Yes," she whispered, "but not clever. There was something in her eyes, something glinting like obsidian, buried deep beneath the surface. The candlelight didn't reflect there." Snow's fingers trembled on the stem of her goblet. "May I be excused?" she asked. The Queen did not respond, so Snow stood. She turned toward the door, and that's when the Queen rose, graceful, slow, as though time itself paused for her. In her hand was a dagger, ancient, ornate. The hilt was shaped like a serpent, biting its own tail, and the blade shimmered faintly, as if it had tasted magic. Snow ran. The forest greeted her like an old friend. The cold air bit her skin, but she welcomed it. The thorns tore her nightdress, roots caught her ankles, branches sliced her arms, but none of it stopped her. She ran until the castle lights vanished behind the hills, until the Queen's voice could no longer find her, until she could no longer hear anything but the wind whispering through the trees. And then she collapsed. She awoke to silence. Morning light, thin and grey, filtered through the canopy above. The forest floor was soft beneath her, blanketed in moss and last year's leaves. Somehow, impossibly, she had survived the night. Snow sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. Her arms were scratched, her feet were bloody, her heart thudded against her ribs like a drum calling war. But she was alive. A soft chirp startled her. A bird, small and black-eyed, hopped a few feet away, watching her. Then another, then 3 more. Snow stood, wobbling, and the birds flitted into the trees, flapping gently, as if waiting. She followed. They led her deeper into the woods. The trees grew older here, their trunks wider, their bark darker. Some of them had faces, knotted knots and twisted knots that looked like mouths, screaming silently toward the sky. Snow passed mushrooms shaped like ears. She passed stones that pulsed faintly, as though breathing. She passed a pond that reflected nothing at all. And then a cottage, hidden between 2 leaning yew trees. It looked like something from a child's drawing, small, crooked, with a sagging roof and windows like watching eyes. But there was smoke curling from the chimney, and the door stood open. Snow stepped inside. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of herbs and wood smoke. The walls were lined with shelves, crammed with dried flowers, jars of ash, and books, whose titles shifted when she blinked. There was no sign of anyone, until a voice, low and creaking like a door long unopened, spoke behind her. "Not many make it this far." Snow turned. An old woman stood by the hearth, cloaked in black. Her eyes were clouded white, and yet Snow felt them land on her like stones. I didn't mean to intrude," Snow stammered. "I was running from my stepmother." The old woman smiled. Her teeth were sharp. "Yes," she said, "the Queen." Snow's stomach turned. "You know her?" "I knew her," the woman said, "before she gave herself to the mirror." Snow sat by the fire as the woman brewed something in a copper pot. It smelled of nettle and salt and something darker. "She was once a girl like you," the old woman said, "hungry for love, hungry to be seen. And when the king looked at her, she thought she had found power, but she found the mirror instead." Snow said. The woman nodded. "It doesn't show you the truth. It shows you what you want to see, and once you believe it, it becomes truth." Snow swallowed. "It told her I would surpass her." "It tells each queen that," the woman said, "and each queen tries to kill the next." Snow's hands curled in her lap. "Then it won't stop." "No," the woman said, "not unless the mirror breaks." Snow looked up. "Can it be broken?" The old woman poured a thick black liquid into a small stone cup. "Only by the one it fears most." Snow didn't ask who that was. She already knew. That night, Snow slept in the loft of the cottage, wrapped in furs that smelled of pine and old magic. She dreamed of her mother, but not the soft, gentle figure she remembered. This time, her mother's face was hollowed her eyes dark, and her lips moved silently as though warning her. When she awoke, a raven sat at the foot of her bed, watching. It opened its beak, and the Queen's voice echoed out.
"Come home, Snow."
Snow sat up slowly. The raven's eyes gleamed like oil. "We're not finished yet." Snow left the cottage at dawn. The old woman didn't try to stop her. She only watched, expression unreadable, as Snow stepped into the woods again. Before she vanished into the trees, the woman pressed a small object into her palm. It was a shard of mirror, no bigger than a coin, edges dulled but still reflecting dim light. "When the time comes," she whispered, "you'll know what to do." Snow tucked it into the folds of her cloak, unsure what terrified her more, that she might fail or that she might succeed. The forest was different now, not just darker, though the clouds above had thickened, blotting out the early sun. It watched her now. The birds no longer chirped, the trees no longer swayed with the breeze. The silence had weight. Snow felt it press against her ears, her chest, her thoughts. She walked anyway, because somewhere beyond the trees, the castle waited, and inside the castle, her destiny. Not a throne, not revenge, but the end of something old and broken. The Queen hadn't left the castle since Snow fled. She stood at the mirror each night, watching the girl move through the forest. At first, she sent hunters, then shadows, then worse. But Snow had not died. She had changed. Now the Queen watched as Snow stepped into the clearing where the old shrine stood, a ruin, even older than the castle itself. Stone columns crumbled and twisted with vines, half buried in the dirt. Snow knelt at the altar. The Queen's breath caught. "What are you doing?" she whispered. In the mirror, Snow placed her hand flat on the stone, whispered something the Queen could not hear. The air around her shimmered. The Queen recoiled as the mirror warped, as if resisting something it didn't understand. Then Snow looked up, and directly into the glass. The Queen took a step back, because Snow was smiling. Snow didn't understand the words she spoke, only that they came from somewhere deeper than memory. The forest had given them to her, or maybe her mother had. A voice that was hers, but not hers, guided her tongue. The stone beneath her hand warmed, the shard in her pocket pulsed, and the air shifted. It was not day or night anymore, not forest or ruin, but something in between. From the shadows between the columns came figures, vague, slow-moving, tall and bent. Their faces were hidden, but Snow knew them, the former queens. One carried a silver comb, another a ribbon soaked in blood. A third held a piece of red apple in shriveled fingers. They did not speak, they only waited. Snow held out the shard, and the figures bowed. In the castle, the Queen screamed. The mirror was bleeding. A thin, steady line of red dripped down its surface, thick like syrup, staining the floor below. She tried to turn away, but her reflection would not let her. It was no longer her face in the glass. It was Snow's, not the girl, the woman, older, stronger, wearing a crown of twisted branches and bone. You gave me your kingdom, the reflection said. Now I return the favour. The queen raised the serpent dagger, plunged it into the mirror. The glass shattered, outward, not inward, and the room filled with a wind that howled like a chorus of the dead. When it stopped, the queen was gone, and the mirror was whole again. Snow returned to the castle at twilight. The gates were open, no guards, no servants, just silence. The air smelled of rose petals and ash. She walked through the halls barefoot, trailing mud and leaves across marble floors. Her fingers brushed familiar walls. Her eyes scanned every shadow. The throne room stood empty, but the mirror waited, whole, silent. She stepped toward it. For the first time in her life, it showed her only herself. No magic, no whispers, just her. Snow turned. The throne sat before her, veiled in gold and dust. She sat, not because she wanted to rule, but because someone had to end it. The forest watched. The wind returned, and far below the castle, in the stone crypts where no one dared go, something breathed for the first time in centuries. Something old, something hungry, because the mirror might be gone, but the curse was not. The first night on the throne, Snow didn't sleep. The castle groaned around her, its ancient stones shifting like restless bones. Firelight flickered in iron sconces, casting long shadows that danced and stretched like memories. She felt the weight of the mirror's absence, but its influence hadn't vanished. It had only changed. Snow could feel it in the walls, in the air, in her blood. She wandered the halls barefoot, cloak trailing behind her like smoke. Doors she'd never opened before now creaked wide at her touch. She passed old paintings, their colours dulled and faces scratched out. One portrait had no head at all, just a crown floating above a blank space. When she looked again, the crown was gone. In the kitchens, she found bowls set for meals no one had prepared. Steam curled from empty pots. A lullaby hummed from the next room, though no one was there. Snow shut every door she passed, but the sound of breathing followed her, low and shallow, like someone asleep just out of sight. She did not run. She was not a child anymore, but she was afraid, and fear in the castle was not a weakness. It was a compass. It told you where not to go and where you must. On the second night, Snow followed the breath. It led her down, below the throne room, past the servants' quarters, beyond the wine cellars, where dust-covered bottles no one had opened in her lifetime. A narrow staircase twisted downward. The walls turned from stone to something darker, slick and uneven, like flesh or soil. Her steps echoed differently here, absorbed instead of reflected. At the bottom stood a door, carved of bone and bound in iron bands blackened with time. A child's handprint, long faded, marked its centre. Snow pressed her own hand against it. The door opened with a whisper. Inside was a chamber, circular, wide, and breathing. The air moved in and out like a lung, and in the centre, hovering in a shaft of cold, blue light, was the mirror, not broken, not shattered, but changed. It had no frame now, no glass, just a void, spinning like water disturbed by wind, rippling inward forever. Snow stepped toward it. Her reflection did not appear, but something else did. A girl, pale and hollow-eyed, wearing Snow's old dress, the one torn and mud-streaked from her flight into the forest. She raised a hand and pointed at Snow, then pressed her fingers to her lips. Shh! Snow backed away, but the mirror pulsed. The girl stepped forward, out of the void. She did not touch the ground. She hovered inches above the stone, hair drifting as if underwater. Her mouth did not move, but Snow heard her voice. Not over, not done, not alone. Snow reached for the shard the old woman had given her, still hidden beneath her cloak. The moment her fingers closed around it, the mirror screamed, a sound like shattering glass and splintering bones. The girl collapsed, and the void behind her folded inward, imploding with a thud that shook dust from the ceiling. The mirror was gone. Again, Snow knelt beside the girl, but she was no longer a child. Not Snow, not anyone. The body dissolved like mist, leaving only a crown, small, made of bone and shadow. Snow left it where it lay. In the weeks that followed, the castle changed. Vines pushed through stone, roots cracked tile, windows that once let in moonlight now opened only to blackness, endless and still. But no spirits haunted her, no whispers filled the halls, only the silence remained, and silence at last felt like peace. The villagers told stories of how the queen had died, of how a princess returned, of how the forest had gone quiet for the first time in centuries. But none dared visit, none crossed the threshold. They left offerings on the border, candles, wildflowers, honey and coins. Snow never touched them. The land didn't want worship, only rest. And Snow, she remained in the castle by choice, not as ruler, but as guardian, because something old had ended and something older had begun. She waited not for power or love or vengeance. She waited for the forest to whisper again, because one day it would. One day the mirror would return, and when it did, she would be ready. There is something unnatural about a forest that does not speak. The trees stood in perfect stillness, their branches unmoving, even when the wind blew. Birds no longer sang. No fox left prints in the snow. Even the river that once wound like a silver ribbon through the woods had frozen, not from cold, but from something else, something watching, something waiting. Snow wandered its edges daily, a deep red cloak wrapped around her shoulders. It trailed behind her like blood, dragging across the undergrowth. She did not flinch when shadows moved, or when the silence deepened to something thicker than air. She was the queen now, and the forest obeyed, but it did not trust. Not yet. One morning, she found footprints in the snow, small, bare, child's feet. They led from the tree line to the old well behind the castle, long sealed, long dry. The lid had been chained shut after the last girl had drowned in its depths, chasing the whisper of her dead sister's name. Snow knelt and brushed the frost from the lid. The chains had been broken, not rusted through, torn. From within the well a cold wind blew upward, and in it a voice, soft, familiar as snow. She did not speak. She lowered a rope down, tied to the strongest oak nearby. Her hands were steady as she climbed into the dark, into the cold, into the voice that knew her name. The descent felt endless. Her torch flickered but held. The walls of the well were smooth, as if worn not by water but by touch, hands dragging down, inch by inch. At the bottom there was no water, only a stone floor and a single doorway, carved into the wall where no doorway should have been. The threshold shimmered with frost, and across it, etched deep into the stone, the mirror remembers. Snow stepped through. She entered a corridor of stone and root, the ceiling too low, the walls too narrow. Whispers brushed past her ears, not words, but memories, screams trapped in soil, lullabies sung to empty cradles. She walked until the path opened into a chamber, and there, sitting in the centre of the floor, was a child, the same girl from the mirror. Her eyes were black as the void, her skin pale as bone, and in her hands she held a mirror, small, cracked, and trembling. She did not look up. She whispered to it again and again, "Duck, duck, goose." Snow stepped closer. The girl did not move. Her voice grew louder, more frantic. "Duck, duck, goose." She clutched the mirror tighter. Snow reached out and gently touched her shoulder. The girl went still. Then, in one swift movement, she turned and pressed the mirror against Snow's chest. It didn't hurt, not like a wound. It was deeper, like falling into yourself. Suddenly, Snow stood in a memory, not her own, but someone else's. The Queen's. She saw herself as a child, laughing, running through the halls, her cheeks flushed with joy, and she saw the Queen watching from the shadows, eyes hungry, mouth tight, not out of hatred, but envy, because Snow had what the Queen never did: innocence, love, a future. The memory shifted. The Queen knelt before the mirror, whispering not for beauty, but for replacement. Not who is fairest, but make her mine. Snow gasped, because the mirror had listened. It had twisted her reflection to match the Queen's desire, to mould her, to shape her, to become the next. The vision broke. Snow staggered back in the chamber. The child gone, the mirror shattered at her feet. But she understood now. She hadn't defeated the queen. She'd become her, not in vanity, but in purpose, in protection, in solitude, and in silence. She climbed out of the well in darkness. The rope snapped as she reached the top, but she didn't fall. The earth carried her up, lifted her gently, like it knew, like it remembered. That night, she stood before the broken throne, no longer afraid of the mirror's absence, because it was no longer missing. It was within her, not a curse, not a possession, but a memory,
A legacy.
and she would carry it forward to the next child,
To the next story.
to the next reflection. The days stretched longer, but the castle grew colder. Though Snow's rule went uncontested, no banners flew, no celebration echoed through the halls. The throne remained untouched, and the people, they stayed quiet, far from the woods, far from the whispers, far from her. She did not blame them. Her reflection no longer showed a girl. It showed something else. Eyes hollowed not by sadness, but by knowing. In the silence, Snow began to write. She filled pages with names she remembered from her childhood. Villagers, friends, strangers who'd once looked at her with warmth. And then names she didn't remember at all. But the ink flowed anyway, as if her hand was guided by something deeper, something buried. Each name brought with it a memory, but they weren't hers. They belonged to girls who came before, girls who had vanished into mirrors, girls who had traded their faces to survive. One night, she found herself in the cellar, a place she had once avoided, a place that now called to her. The air was damp, thick with mildew and rust. Shelves lined the stone walls, jars of herbs, dried fruits, old trinkets, and beneath the far shelf, hidden behind loose bricks, she found a box. It was wrapped in crimson cloth and sealed with wax. The emblem of the Queen pressed into it. When she opened it, the scent of roses and rot wafted out. Inside were dozens of mirrors, handheld, cracked, shattered, some still whole. Each one vibrated faintly in her hand, and when she looked closely, she saw eyes looking back, but they weren't her own. She placed them on the floor, one by one, and the room grew colder. The candlelight dimmed, the walls pulsed with a heartbeat not her own, and then they spoke, not aloud, but in her mind. Voices, female, frightened, furious, begging to be freed, cursing to be heard. Some laughed, some screamed. One whispered, "You are the last." Snow did not run. She sat among them. She listened, hour after hour, memory after memory. She watched as a young girl was tricked into the Queen's tower with the promise of sweet cakes. She saw another, hair dark as night, fall asleep beneath an apple tree and never rise. She saw hands, so many hands, reaching through glass, trying to claw back into the world. The queen hadn't ruled through fear, she ruled through stories. She planted them in mirrors, in minds, in rhymes, and each time someone repeated them, they grew stronger. Mirror, mirror, who's the fairest? Words passed down like lullabies, but they were summons, and Snow had spoken them too. She had summoned her fate the moment she whispered those words, and now she was the only one left who could unbind them. Outside, the woods stirred, the trees bent low, groaning under a sudden, unnatural wind. Snow climbed the tower to the highest window and looked out. Children stood at the edge of the forest, silent, still. Each held a mirror in their hand. Each mirror reflected the same face, hers, but younger, untouched, innocent. Snow descended the stairs slowly. By the time she reached the great doors, the children were gone. Only the mirrors remained, placed in a circle on the stone path. She picked one up. The surface shimmered, then turned black. Then a ripple, like a drop of ink in water, and a face emerged. It was the queen, not broken, not defeated, waiting. Snow dropped the mirror and stepped back, but her voice still echoed from the shards. You were meant to take my place. You can't run from what you are. Snow whispered back, I'm not running. She returned to the cellar. She took the mirrors, and one by one she began to bury them beneath moonlight, under roots, at the base of trees older than time. Each mirror silenced, each name spoken aloud and set free, and with each one the castle grew warmer, the silence faded, birdsong returned, but she kept one mirror, just one, the one that didn't speak, the one that showed not her face, but a forest, and in the forest a girl, small, wearing a red hood, walking towards something she couldn't see. Snow closed her eyes. The stories would continue, but not all would end in silence. Some would find their way out, some would be told, and some would listen. Snow awoke before the sun, not in her bed, but in the garden. Dew clung to her skin, in her hands, soil, damp and black beneath her fingernails. She didn't remember falling asleep. She only remembered the dream. A woman in white, eyes hollow, mouth sewn shut, standing behind a shattered mirror, tapping once, twice, and then silence. The kind of silence that lives inside you. The castle had begun to wake again, not fully, just enough to breathe. Windows once fogged were now clear. Crows perched on the battlements, quiet and watchful, like guardians waiting for the next chapter to unfold. But something still lingered in the west wing, a hallway that never warmed, a corridor that creaked even when no one walked through it. Snow avoided it for weeks, until the whisper came again, faint. She is not gone. She carried a lantern into the west wing. The halls there were darker, the stone walls covered in a fine dust that felt like ash. Portraits lined the walls, queens from centuries past, but their eyes had been scratched out. some with knives, some with fingernails, and at the end of the corridor, a door. She had never seen it before, yet she knew what was behind it. Inside was a room untouched by time. A vanity stood in the centre, its surface covered in dried rose petals and broken glass. A comb, a ribbon, a vial of something thick and black, and above it a mirror, not whole, not shattered, alive. The frame pulsed faintly with a red glow, like embers buried beneath the wood. Snow stepped closer. The glass rippled, and in it, her reflection, but not as she was. She was dressed in white, hair combed, lips painted, a doll in a cage of glass, and behind her, hands, reaching, waiting. She didn't touch it, not yet. Instead, she sat, and for the first time, she spoke aloud, not to the mirror, to the room, to the presence watching. I know what you are. No response. I know what you did. The air thickened. Candles along the wall hissed, their flames turning blue. I'm not here to break the spell, she said softly. I'm here to end the story. The mirror cracked, just slightly, a line from corner to corner, like a seam ready to split open. The Queen's voice echoed faintly, behind the glass, like wind moving through a hollow skull. You are nothing without me. Snow smiled, bitter and slow. Then let's find out. She began to tell her own story, not the one written in rhyme, not the one sung to children, but the true one. She spoke of the huntsman who spared her, of the dwarves who were not kind but afraid, of the apple, how it didn't taste of poison but of grief, of waking not to love's kiss but to a scream only she could hear, of mirrors, dozens of them, whispering her name like a threat, and with each word the glass darkened. With each truth the Queen faded until only snow remained. She reached into her pocket and took out the last shard from the cellar, the silent one. It pulsed in her hand. She placed it against the mirror, and the moment they touched, it shattered, not loudly, not violently, but like a breath being held for centuries, finally let go. Snow collapsed to her knees. The walls trembled. The portraits fell, but the castle did not crumble. It exhaled, and then stillness, real stillness, the kind that doesn't follow horror, but healing. Days passed. The forest stopped whispering. The wind no longer sang warnings. The mirrors no longer shimmered, and the townspeople began to return. They found Snow walking the garden paths, barefoot, humming songs no one had heard before. She welcomed them without fear, without a crown, without lies, just a girl who had survived the story and rewritten the ending. But on the far edge of the forest, near the oldest tree, a child sat with a doll in her lap. She whispered to it, a nursery rhyme, one passed down from someone who once knew snow, one that began, mirror, mirror, and as the sun set behind the hills, the doll blinked. The castle was hers now, not by blood, not by claim, but by silence, a kind of inheritance passed down not through lineage, but survival. The townspeople called her queen, though she never wore a crown. She walked the corridors barefoot, her hair unbraided, her dress plain, but the walls recognized her. They burrowed in creaks and sighs, and deep beneath the stone, something that had once pulsed with dark magic now lay still, dead, perhaps, or merely waiting. Snow kept the mirror room sealed. No one else was allowed near it. It didn't matter that the glass had shattered, that the Queen's presence was gone. There was something else still inside, a memory with weight, a shadow that didn't need light to exist. At night, when the wind howled just right, it would rattle the door like breath on old hinges. But Snow didn't fear it anymore. She listened to it like a heartbeat you've lived with long enough to no longer dread. There were new rumours in the village. Some said Snow never truly woke from the Queen's spell, that what now walked the garden paths wasn't quite human. Others said the Queen hadn't died. She'd been absorbed, merged into Snow's shadow, whispering advice, waiting to strike again. But most simply stopped asking questions. They left flowers at the castle gates. They avoided their mirrors after sundown. And they taught their children only half the rhyme, because the full version was too dangerous to speak aloud. One autumn night, the air turned sharply cold. A knock at the castle door. A child stood there, wrapped in too thin fabric, eyes too old for her face. She didn't speak. She simply handed Snow a box. Inside, a music box, and carved into the lid, for the fairest. Snow didn't open it, not immediately. She left it on her bedside table. Night after night, it sat there, silent, until the new moon came, and the castle grew cold again, and Snow, despite everything she'd learned, opened it. The melody was soft at first, a lullaby, unfamiliar but hauntingly sweet. Then, halfway through, it twisted, bent, warped like wood in fire, and from the box rose a faint shimmer of mist. Not smoke, not magic, memory. Snow saw the garden, the Queen, combing her hair, the poisoned apple being carved from a tree that bled red sap, the huntsman crying into his hands, each image more vivid than the last, and finally a girl, herself, but younger, smiling, unaware, untouched. The mist receded, the music slowed, and the box clicked shut. Snow stared at it. Her hands trembled, not from fear, from recognition. The past wasn't haunting her, it was calling her back. She returned to the mirror room one final time. She unlocked the door with a key no one else knew existed. Inside, the glass lay in pieces, but the frame remained, and from its wood, vines had grown, dark, thorny, blooming with black roses that smelled faintly of honey and rot. She touched one petal, and the mirror spoke, not aloud, not with words, but with sensation, warmth, pain, longing, the kind of ache that says, You are not finished. Snow knew what it meant. She had ended one story, but the castle held many, each mirror a doorway, each rhyme a trap, and she was now its keeper, not its prisoner. She walked the halls with a lantern in hand. She whispered to the portraits. She watched the forest for signs of change, and when the moon was high, she would sometimes see shapes in the trees. Children playing games that no one taught them, games that rhymed, games that echoed. The castle didn't slumber anymore. It waited, and Snow waited with it, because stories never truly end. They just change their skin. And deep in the cellar, behind the last locked door, a voice sang soft and low. Apples red and mirrors cracked. The queen is gone, but she'll come back. When the fairest speaks a lie, she'll rise again, and someone dies. Sleep well, you've heard the tale. Now try to forget it, because she never will, and mirrors never truly forget.